Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a very refreshful lunch break, and I thank the panelists to have taken their seats so fast. This is going to be a longer panel with a lot of academic stuff, but I think it will be very fascinating. First, I need to regretfully inform you that Professor Yaakov Ariel from the University of North Carolina has been fallen ill and therefore couldn't attend this conference. But in his place, Professor Jeffrey Kaplan, the organizer of the conference, will present very briefly his PowerPoint presentation. So I will ask Professor Kaplan to take the stage and present Professor Ariel's presentation.
Yeah, this is actually, Yaakov is a very old friend. He's an expert on Jewish extremism, the Third Temple movement, and that sort of thing. His view and mine are somewhat different in that while his study is more academic, I was actually in Hebron al-Khalil during the Intifada, and I saw a lot of this develop. So I didn't want the subject to be lost from the panel when he fell ill. And so I put together just a brief PowerPoint to get some of the points across. I do want to stress that this is my view and not his, as he would probably disagree with some of it. But it's a subject I really love, and it was a very big chapter in my dissertation way back in the Dark Ages. So, if we could begin. This is a picture of Rabbi Moshe Levinger, who is a very important figure in the Israeli settlement movement. In fact, he was one of the foundational figures. This is in Hebron, which is a place I know well, and outside of the mosque, the Ibrahimi Mosque. So it becomes a very important place in history. Let's see here. Come on, guy. Green button. The green button is not cooperating. This always happens. There we go. Gush Emanim was the first, and this translates literally the block of the faithful. In 1967, immediately after the Six-Day War, a group of Israelis under the leadership of Rabbi Levinger came to the Park Hotel in Hebron. And of course, with fulsome hospitality, they were welcomed. And Fayez Kouazmi, who was the owner of the hotel, asked with all great politeness, "How long are you staying?" And they answered in Hebrew, which he didn't speak, "Until the Messiah returns." So they were planning on checking in for a long time. The background of Gush Emanim was Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook, who was a rabbi who had a yeshiva called Merkaz Harav. And out of that yeshiva came the core of the early settlement movement. They were something new in the Israeli Jewish world. They were national religious. That is, they wanted to serve in the army, but they wanted to carry out the rituals of the ultra-Orthodox. It was a mix that was never going to work very well. The interesting thing that they did, and this is from a theological perspective, in Jewish tradition, the idea of redemption, of the end of the world, has a lot of interesting stories to it. But it is, in the majority vision, a personal Messiah, somebody who will come and redeem them. The story is there will be a rabbi named Rabbi Ben Joseph. He will come, he will gather the righteous remnant of the Jews who have not assimilated, which by then was a small minority, and he will lead them into battle against the Gentile world, which of course they lost. and he was killed. 40 days later, Rabbi Ben David came. He brought him back to life along with all the fallen Jews. They succeed, and they create a paradise for Jews. It's an interesting story, but if you've been waiting 5,000 years for it to happen, it's obvious that you may get frustrated. So what Gush Emanim did is they said, no, redemption is not a personal Messiah. It is the land. And all we need to do to bring redemption is to get the full land of Israel as promised in the Bible. How big that is, nobody really knew, because so much has been lost and geography obviously has changed. So they say 1 centimeter of land is 1 centimeter close to redemption. We'll just keep expanding until God says you got it. Come on. This is going to be one of those days, is it not? Check it, man. Yeah, I've been doing that. There we go. This is where real violence starts to take place. This is kach, which means thus. And thus is a racist movement that arose in Israel. He was an American rabbi. He had an organization in America called the Jewish Defense League, which was a very violent group. They used a kind of thuggish approach to violence, which is street violence. They just beat people up if they weren't Jewish. And they imported this to Israel, created the Kach movement. They actually had a few seats in the Knesset. But what makes it interesting from our perspective is that when asked about this violence, and I did have the opportunity in Chicago once to interview Rabbi Kahane at some length, and he referred constantly to the Holocaust. He said, not only never again, but get them before they get us. Our violence is justified by the violence that was done to the Jewish people. Therefore, our violence is not a sin. Our violence is reasonable. The Jewish underground was the emergence of the first true terrorist movement after Israel became a state. Before that was pre-1948. But that was quite something else. But here they had a plan, and the plan ultimately was to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, which was forbidden not only by Israeli law and by the world, but more important than that, from their perspective, it was very much against Jewish law. You can't do that. You cannot set foot on the Temple Mount, and you cannot, with your hands, rebuild the third temple. They thought they'd do it. While they were planning this, they had other operations as well. For example, they cut the brake lines on school buses, taking Palestinian children. They planted bombs in the cars of Palestinian mayors. Remember Bassem Shaka from my time there. He lost his legs doing that. Several others lost their lives doing this. So it was a very violent movement. In the Middle East, what makes it so interesting, no matter what side you're on, there's what you see, there's what you don't see, and there's what God alone knows. And so what you saw is when the plan to bomb the Al-Aqsa Mosque started to come to fruition, all of a sudden the Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service, realized we better do something. Before that, they said, we don't know what's going on there. Now they suddenly knew. But what you don't see is that isn't the real reason they were stopped. The real reason is a guy named David Good, who was the American consul in East Jerusalem. He was visiting the Hebron University on the very day that the Jewish underground guys decided to go there. He's there quite by accident, maybe. But they decided their operation was they were going to go in that university and start shooting students for no particular reason, which they did, and they killed a number. And the American State Department was furious because David Good was hiding under a desk, trying not to get shot himself. So within a week of that happening, the Jewish underground was rolled up, and that was the end of them. They all went to prison. The bomb in the Ibrahimi Mosque. the shootings in the Ibrahimi Mosque, 1994. This was done by Dr. Baruch Goldstein. He was a doctor in Kiryat Arba, the Jewish settlement there, and he said he was doing this for revenge. Revenge for what? Nobody exactly knew. There had been tit-for-tat violence going on for a long time in Hebron. He went in there with a machine gun and just killed as many worshippers as he could until he ran out of bullets, at which point the remaining survivors took the gun out of his hand and literally tore him apart, physically tore him apart. Two footnotes or two outcomes of this, which are very interesting. One is this mosque was an example of a shared sacred space. The Jews also worshiped there because it was also the mosque, the burial place of Abraham. And so they simply split the time. The Muslims had their time, the Jews had theirs, and even though the Jews involved were settlers, and so they were quite extreme, there was never any conflict over that sacred space up until this time. That's footnote one. Footnote number two, from a religious studies perspective, is even more interesting. In this, Dr. Goldstein's grave became a sacred site for Jews who are of this extreme messianic persuasion. And so he is worshipped there as a tzaddik, as a saint. And people go there to pray for miracles. It's something that's very similar to mystical Sufi Muslim rites, where you'll see in Morocco and other countries. The burial tombs of saints are shared by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, seeking miracles and intercession. So those are the two results that came out of it. The Third Temple movement is perhaps the most interesting, although the least violent. In this case, the idea is the third temple, the third Jewish temple, must be built on exactly the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It can be built nowhere else. You cannot share this space. Maimonides, the great Jewish sage in the Middle Ages, created a rule which is still normative in Judaism, which is when it's time to build the third temple, Jews cannot do this with their hands, and they cannot do it by human agency. When God is ready, he will build the third temple, and he will send it down from the sky, slowly enough that all people will see it and realize that it's from God. And there will be no violence. More than that, probably everyone will want to become Jewish at that point. So no, it hasn't happened yet. But these movements are seeking in different ways to change that. The Temple Mount Faithful is a tiny group that every year brings the cornerstone of the third temple that they want to plant in the mosque. Every year they get within, maybe 3 or 4 streets of it, and the police arrest them and take away their little temple marker thing. And then they give it back to them later, and they do it again the next year. It's become an annual rite of passage that creates laughter, basically, in the Israeli press. More interesting is the Temple Institute. What the Temple Institute is saying is we're not there to physically change the status quo. What we're doing is training the priesthood and recreating the implements of ancient Jewish religious rites. Ancient Jewish religious rites consisted primarily of animal sacrifice. And it had a number of interesting implements, rituals, and the like. They are trying to recreate a priesthood, which was hereditary, and that's obviously been disrupted big time. But they're trying to recreate this priesthood so that when the moment comes, they'll be ready to use the temple. They're not in the business of physically trying to change it. Finally, we've been talking, and as we talk, people are assuming that we are talking about violence between Jews and Muslims. That is not necessarily true at all. When the Koch movement was attacking Palestinians, they didn't stop to question them about their religion. And there is a substantial number of Palestinian Christians. And a lot of them were attacked. They made no differentiation, and frankly, they didn't care. They just wanted all Arabs, Palestinians, and non-Jews, of which there are a number who are neither one or the other, to leave the Holy Land, whether it's by their own will or being put in trains in a very Nazi kind of image. They were not ashamed of that at all. So the fact that a number of churches have also been attacked, have been blown up, that Christian believers have been attacked, killed, and their sacred sites vandalized or utterly burned or destroyed, is also something that is part of this cycle of religious violence. Once again, as I tried to really stress in the introduction to this conference, an attack on one religion is an attack on them all. Today's victims are tomorrow's perpetrators, and that there are a people of goodwill, and the majority of people are of goodwill in the Islamic Ummah, the Islamic world, in the Christian world, and in the Jewish world. We just have to know how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaplan. And now it is time for our second panelist, who is going to be Dr. Katalin Pető-Kis, who is a senior research fellow at the Global Peace Institute. Please, Dr. Kis, take the stand.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. I've been working as a practitioner in the field of counterterrorism. From a law enforcement perspective, so-called soft targets, including religious sites, have always been the focus of our interest. As you may know, these places offer extraordinary opportunities for terrorists to inflict fear and cause a considerable number of casualties. People tend to think that violent acts targeting, for instance, places of worship come out of the blue without any preemptive warning signs. The general perception is that it is way beyond their capabilities to substantially elevate the level of security regarding these places. Now allow me to draw your kind attention to the relevance of openly available information that can help us dispel these, let's say, fallacies. I firmly believe that once we better understand the modus operandi of these violent actors, this will help us identify the security challenges Christian communities face. I have undertaken research regarding 4 countries in the MENA region that will be subject to the project, namely Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. The source for all this information originates from the University of Maryland's Global Terrorism Database. In this quantitative assessment, I have chosen attacks targeting Christian places of worship that occurred between 1970 and 2018. The ultimate goal of this research is to draw the lessons from examined case studies and attempt to make suggestions on how existing security arrangements of religious sites should be enhanced to achieve a more effective security regime. With this in mind, allow me to summarize the key takeaways from each phase. The chart on this first slide differentiates attacks in accordance with the perpetrator's modus operandi. What we can see is that terrorists preferably resort to bombing. This trend should be considered when the security of a religious site is designed. Accordingly, the surroundings of places of worship should be integrated into the security plans of these places. It would be highly advisable to raise awareness of staff and the congregation on suspicious objects placed near the church and develop protocols for handling such incidents. It should also be stressed that plots have great relevance in identifying the offenders. The scene itself should also be handled with expertise. Precious evidence is present there, and once ruined, these signs can never be reconstructed. Therefore, protocols should determine clear instructions on how to preserve these valuable traces. It may also be important to mention that prior to an attack, violent actors need to get to know the scene and its environment. They need to be familiar with certain features of the target area, and therefore they will map the surroundings and identify vulnerabilities in their security. Such surveillance operations can, however, be detected by trained and observant staff. Physical security measures, for instance, CCTV cameras, can also prevent the planting of an explosive device. It is not enough, however, to install such cameras. They should be monitored on a duty course. Otherwise, information from this source cannot be utilized. Considering the potential for bombing, for instance, trash bins on the premises should be kept locked. Parked cars should be kept at a safe distance. Plants and trees should be regularly trimmed to avoid invisible areas. Moving on to the next slide, weapons are important indicators of offenders' technical capabilities and their ideologies. Better understanding the ways and logistics of arms acquisition offers valuable intelligence when compiling risk assessments. We all know that improvised explosive devices offer handy benefits for violent actors. Unfortunately, they are aware of this conclusion too. Let's consider that so-called dual-use products are widely available. You can purchase and have them delivered home online. More concerning is that practical instructions on how to construct a viable improvised device is also handy information. You do not need to have sophisticated skills to build a primitive explosive device which can cause serious harm and damage. Moreover, the actor do not need to get close to the target and can operate the device remotely. Personally, I have not seen a case yet where there were no indicators during these preparatory actions and the process of manufacturing a malicious device. Unfortunately, authorities are notified about these suspicious circumstances only after the regretful incident has already happened. Therefore, we should draw our attention to the direct environment of the perpetrators, because this is the best place to notice these warning signs. Accordingly, improving communication with the public about risks would add other means for a more coherent detection of malevolent activities. In parallel, public awareness should be drawn to early warning signs of suspicious activities, such as indicators of unusual purchases, or the possession of processing equipment, unusual odors, suspicious containers in the waste, or the consequences of accidents during the experimental phase of the development. It seems obvious that the security of the congregation is a shared responsibility. Community outreach programs should educate churchgoers on potential warning signs. It is not enough, however, to notice these indicators. We need to make sure that authorities will receive this crucial information. Therefore, the public should also be trained to embed the habit of reporting these early warning signs. It is important to stress here that the aim is not to magnify the community's paranoia, but to enhance its resilience. Once members of the community are prepared what to do in such a case, this may also help reduce the panic a terrorist attack seeks to trigger. As the following chart illustrates, a remarkable ratio of perpetrators remained unknown. We should draw the lessons from this fact. Obviously, there is a lot to be done in this regard. We need to acknowledge that present staff may not be well trained to detect those warning signs that will be crucial to identify the offenders. Awareness raising through trainings could substantially increase the capabilities in this regard. For the rest of the examined case studies, religious extremists and accordingly their ideological objective motivated their violent acts. With all this in mind, it is of great importance to know more about the ideological beliefs or doctrines of local radical non-state actors that they use to justify their actions. Once we know more about the local threat landscape, this will help us better identify the means of how to tackle them. Here we have arrived at the most relevant step to harden the soft target nature of a religious site. This is to build a so-called security-oriented mindset. This means that the risks and circumstances should be considered from a different perspective, from a more security-oriented aspect, but still in a resilient manner. First of all, a consistent risk assessment is necessary. This starts with the evaluation of risk factors. These are ever-changing circumstances. Therefore, risk assessments should be made on a periodical basis. It is also important that in the case of, for instance, a high-profile religious event, risks should be meticulously reassessed. Let's move on to the next step, which is designing a security system. It is of utmost relevance that we need to consider the idiosyncrasies of a church. It is crucial to find a delicate balance between the function of a religious site and the necessary security arrangements. In sum, we cannot jeopardize the open nature of these places. For enhanced security, concentric defense circles are to be established around the church. This so-called defense in depth concept may ensure that in case an attacker penetrates one layer of defense, may be intercepted in a subsequent layer. As a first defense circle, we should gather information about potential risks. Open source information and partnerships are of great importance in this regard. Proactive security measures, such as surveillance cameras and security personnel, are the second step in the concept. An effective security system may thwart or deter malicious acts on the religious side. Detecting suspicious objects forms the third defensive layer. We need to remember that the details of these devices hold important information about the perpetrators, such as traces left behind by the attackers, as well as information on their arms acquisition network. Therefore, these objects should be handled with responsibility and great care. Besides these, very common vulnerabilities can be strengthened once the security mindset is applied. For instance, during service, the entrance of the church is generally unnoticed. As the congregation faces the altar, volunteers from the community should turn around and pay constant attention to these gateways. Finally, partnerships are crucial elements in enhancing the security of places of worship. A mutual relationship with local police forces would bring only benefits to the congregation. The local law enforcement agency could help identify the security gaps around or inside the building, and could partake in the training of staff and members of the community. Establishing communication channels may also help to respond to a violent act in a timely manner, reducing the harm that such an incident may induce. I do hope I have explored new areas for consideration. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this talk and for keeping the schedule. Our next panelist is going to be Dr. Anthony Kelso, an associate professor from Angelo State University, Texas. Dr. Kelso, please.
Hello. I would like to thank the Danube Institute for inviting me to address, I think, is a underreported and under-researched topic. And today I'm going to take you through the ideology and practice of this jihadi war against Christians. The second slide that I have, I've picked 5 quotes from the Islamic State movement, which is the most viscerally anti-Christian of the jihadi groups. And I think we really do need to take jihadis seriously. They speak to multiple audiences, but I think generally they're not crazy, they're not stupid, and they mean what they say. The first quote comes from the 9th edition of the Islamic State's English language magazine, Rumiyya, which means Rome, and it speaks to the eschatology of the Islamic State movement. For this reason, one should seek closeness to Allah by targeting their priests, monks, and others, those who serve as caretakers for the belligerent Christians, harming them as they are in fact leader of world of disbelief, kufr, and in killing them is the greatest of rewards by Allah's permission. The second quote that I want to read is from Al-Nawa magazine, and it occurs slightly before the 2019 Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, where 3 churches were targeted and 2 Western tourist hotels were targeted by local affiliates of the Islamic State. And the quote itself was widely characterized as a call for revenge for the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand undertaken by far-right extremist Brandon Tarrant. Make the Crusaders pay a price in their temples while they realize their incredulous rituals. The Easter bombing attacks killed over 250 people, most of them churchgoers. The last 3 quotes that I have are all attributable to the first spokesperson of the Islamic State movement, Abu Muhammad al-Andani. And he was, I think, a very effective propagandist, but also he was a true believer. And it gives you an insight into the various dimensions, particularly the anti-Christian dimension of the Islamic State's ideology. In 2014, he utters, "Oh, our people, the Sunnis, oh, you the tribes of good. You have tried all regimes, and you have witnessed the treachery of all these parties and those failing perverted groups. You are invited to join hands with your sons, the Muhajirin, to form a solid front against the Crusader Rafidi plots and the Magi Iranian expansion in Mesopotamia and all Muslim lands, so to restore your Islamic caliphate." Now, the point that I'm going to try to make in this presentation is if you take a look at intercommunal violence in the Middle East, it's largely Muslim against Muslim, Sunni against Shia. And it is my point of view is that the Sunni jihadists attack the Shia because they believe they're a polytheistic sect. And that attacks and sectarian divisions within the Muslim world has generated Sunni assaults against Christian communities worldwide. The following quote that I have from Adani, once again, and he was a great repository for quotes, and he's frequently cited. And this speaks to the apocalyptic dimension of the Islamic State's ideology, which makes it distinct from its predecessor, Al-Qaeda. We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women. By permission of Allah, the Exalted, this is his promise to us. He is glorified, and he does not fail in his promise. If we do not reach it the time, then our children and grandchildren will reach it, and they will sell your sons and slaves in the slave market. And the final quote that I have, and I think this was a particularly prescient quote, again in 2014, and it is credited or blamed for uncorking a massive spiral of violence of Islamic State militants in Europe, including the mortifying attacks in Paris and Brussels and across the board. Virtually no European city was not targeted by some sort of Islamic extremist committed to the caliphate's cause. If you kill a disbelieving American or European, especially the spiteful and filthy French, or an Australian, or a Canadian, or any other disbelievers from the disbelievers waging war, including the citizens of the countries that entered a coalition against the Islamic State, then rely on Allah, kill him in any manner or way, however it may be. Smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, or run over him with your car. Now, if you recall the Islamic State terror campaign in Europe, that was waged at its height between 2015 and 2018. Knives were used, explosives were used, gunfire was used, cars were used, trucks were used, axes were used. I mean, I don't recall any effort at using rocks as a lethal instrument, but they would have done it. All right, the next slide. I'm going to take a look, and I'm probably just going to have enough time, given the issues pressing, to give you a sense of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda's ideology. I'll start with the Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not known for being an overtly sectarian group. However, its main doctrines are infused with anti-Christian symbolism, which is predicated upon some sort of nefarious Zionist crusader order, complot of Jews and Christians to control the Middle East, to support apostate regimes in the Islamic world, and to ensure that Israel survives at the expense of the Palestinians. And by evoking the idea of a crusader, Al-Qaeda is evoking past crusades, wars over the control of Jerusalem, including the Christian sacking of Jerusalem in 1099, where pretty much there was a policy of ethnic cleansing directed toward Jews and Muslims. It evokes the Sykes-Picot Accord after the First World War, where the French and British divided up Muslim territories, formerly Ottoman territories. It evokes the 1917 Balfour Declaration by the British government promising the Jews a home in Palestine. It evokes memories of the 1991 Gulf War, where you had large numbers of US troops in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, viewed by Al-Qaeda as an occupation force that defiles the twin sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina. Al-Qaeda has consistently talked about recovering past Muslim territory, particularly what was Islamic Spain. The reconquest of Al-Andalus is a clarion call for their movement. In 2014, Donald Holbrook published a book on Al-Qaeda, and he made a very important point, that the religious and cultural hostility of Al-Qaeda against the West is underappreciated, and he was absolutely right. If you take a look at Al-Qaeda propaganda, there was an emphasis at attacking the editorial offices of Charlie Hebdo that was in fact attacked in 2015. Much of its editorial staff was killed. They emphasized the discriminatory impact of burqa and minaret bans. Now, to be fair to Al-Qaeda, let's see here. To be fair to Al-Qaeda, their official line is to avoid attacks against places of religious worship. And Zawahiri, the former leader of the al-Qaeda movement, made that an emphasis. However, the real problem for al-Qaeda is that the post-9/11 era has resulted in the fragmentation of its movement. Al-Qaeda Central, in effect, controls nothing. And if you take a look at the behavior of its regional branches, Al-Qaeda's Somali branch, Al-Shabaab, engaged in notorious attacks against Christians. In Nairobi's Westgate Mall, Christians and Muslims were separated. Christians were slaughtered. In northern Kenya, in 2015, at the Garissa College, again, Christian and Muslim students were separated, Muslims were liberated, Christians were slaughtered. And so, in effect, al-Qaeda has had a problem controlling its associates and affiliates across the world. Al-Qaeda militants in Indonesia, in Iraq, in Nigeria, all have been associated with church attacks. All right, we're going to move on to the Islamic State. And the most systematic critique of Christianity that any jihadi group has ever produced comes from the 9th edition of Rumiyya. And I'll just give you the main points. The Gospels are Jewish fiction that falsify Jesus' life and message. Christianity is shaped by the incorporation of polytheistic theological influences that prevailed in the Roman imperial territories during Christianity's early growth. Jesus' crucifixion, death, and resurrection are apocryphal tales that falsely deify his theological status. Catholic saints mirror Shia practices, perverting the unity of God's message. And most of all, Christianity is presented as a dying polytheistic religion contaminated by secularism. And all of this reflects the theological foundation of Islam that respects Christians and Jews as people of the book, but demand their subservience to Islamic authority. Hence, the organization into cloistered communities, demis, and the payment of religious tax, zakat. Failure to obey secondary status requires brutal repression and subjugation. All right, now I want to talk about the eschatology of the Islamic State, because here it is infused with anti-Christian sentiment. The movement interprets prophetic hadith. Hadith are oral and written stories of the Prophet Muhammad that are not incorporated within the Quran. And both its first two English language magazines, Dabiq and Rumiyya, are rooted in an interpretation of Islamic eschatology, that the world is coming to an end, and that before the world's end, within the Muslim world, there will be fitna, there will be division, conflict. And it is really the Islamic State and the need for the creation of a caliphate to end that division and disunity within the Islamic world. That will then uncork a series of events leading to divine intercession where the Christian West will be overcome. You'll have the appearance of the Islamic Redeemer, the Mahdi. Jesus will intercede. Islam will be triumphant across the globe, and the Christian West will fall. All right, I think I have a little bit more time, but not much. And so I'm just going to conclude with some observations regarding the jihadi war against Christians globally. In 2017, the British government produced a white paper that called what was going on, especially during the Islamic State's early state-building project, a genocide of Christians. Not only was it a genocide of Christians, but the Yazidi and other populations as well, particularly heterodox Muslim minorities. In 1900, the Christian population was roughly about a fifth. Today is under 4%. The impact on Christian communities, especially as a consequence of the Iraq War and the growth of al-Qaeda in Iraq, today's Islamic State movement, was devastating. The Christian population declined from over 1 million to presently around 200,000, and that's likely to decline. The white paper also talks about systematic repression, discrimination, violence, and ethnic cleansing across the Middle East. And it equates this ethnic cleansing with the cleansing of heterodox Muslim minorities and also the Yazidi. I'll just roughly go through what I was going to present, but time is rapidly diminished. We can talk about some of these things during the Q&A session. What I've done here is I've taken a look at a subset of jihadi violence against churches, all right? And against churches during religious holidays, Christmas and Easter. And you will see bombings in Indonesia, you will see bombings in Iraq, you will see bombings in Nigeria, you will see bombings in Egypt and in Nigeria. Continuing on, even in Pakistan, there have been attacks against Christian populations. In Egypt, in 2017, the Palm Sunday attack in Alexandria, again by ISIS. And the most devastating of these attacks occurred during Easter in Sri Lanka in 2019, where over 250 people died. The latest church bombing occurred in Nigeria, Pentecostal Sunday, in June of 2022. Now, I've constructed a chart that looks at church attacks across the globe from 2010. I calculate there were 39 lethal jihadi attacks on churches across the world, where close to 800 people had died and wounding over thousands. So jihadi violence today, anti-Christian violence today, is particularly prominent in Africa, where it is growing in places where it had been previously non-existent, Mozambique and Congo. And I will argue, as this anti-Christian violence continues, particularly in Africa, but across the world, there are likely to have some sort of ramifications in Europe. There have been, in fact, church attacks in Europe. They've been fairly minor. There have been plots to attack major churches, Notre Dame, La Familia Sagrada in Barcelona, and St. Paul's Cathedral. And so as the African phase of the Islamic State's anti-Christian cleansing increases, I would expect that the propaganda of those local affiliates will be incorporated into the central organization, having devastating consequences for Europe. And I think I'll end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now for a bit more lighthearted presentation, I'll ask Dr. Christian Patrick Alexander, Senior Research Fellow at Trends Research Center, who joined us from Abu Dhabi, to please hold your presentation.
Thank you. Well, first off, I want to thank Danube and Dr. Kaplan for inviting me. Just a brief overview, Trends Research and Advisory is an independent think tank that's stationed in Abu Dhabi, UAE. Obviously, there are a couple of others, the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Emirates Policy Center. But, again, just so you have an idea of who I am, and I'm obviously not a spokesperson of the UAE government, just to make this clear, to preface this. But of course, tolerance factors big into one of the foreign policy, domestic policy objectives of the UAE. So again, here the point is to unpack the concept of tolerance and to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what they're planning on doing. Basically, for those who are not really very familiar with some of the Gulf states and the political systems in the region, this is just a very brief overview here. Obviously, many are familiar with Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but there are 7 emirates. There's a federal system in place in the UAE headed by the government that's located in Abu Dhabi. It's a monarchy, a rentier state. The majority of the population is foreign, meaning that 85% of the population is made up of expats. mainly from the Philippines, from Africa, from India, Pakistan, and so on and so forth. And the Emiratis really only make up 10 to 15% of the total population. Now, the UAE always likes to emphasize the notion or the fact that there are about 200 nationalities and about 40 churches that are present and that are open to practice and practice freely in the UAE, particularly in Dubai. And of course, the UAE presents itself as a small state actor with big ambitions. It employs soft power strategies. And of course, you could argue that tolerance is part of this soft approach that is somewhat, in essence, trying to tackle the concept of counterterrorism or terrorism from a kind of reactive perspective in that sense. Last but not least, tourism obviously factors big into how the UAE is viewed and projects itself. Usually is a high-end travel destination. It's investment friendly. If you look at some of their sovereign wealth funds and their foreign direct investments, they're very much focused on economics and foreign aid. They're one of the major foreign aid donors in the world, and they also like to emphasize that a lot of their foreign aid is without strings attached. That is not with any particular set of how this money is to be spent. Of course, there are sometimes countries that get preferential treatment, but nonetheless, foreign aid factors into this whole equation. And obviously, as of recent, especially after the Arab Spring, you've seen a more assertive UAE foreign policy take on, different hotspots in the region. And of course, also the idea that the UAE is diversifying its alliances more increasingly so, as we've seen with Egypt, with Turkey, and a number of other countries. Okay, briefly, and I don't want to kind of get too deep into this issue, but tolerance, how is it presented? How is it discussed? Obviously a very basic definition would be putting up with something you do not like often in order to get along with better with others. Again, it's a very basic definition. And here it's important to point out that implicit in this definition or concept of tolerance is that differences are important, that there are different forms of tolerance, if you so want, political tolerance, moral tolerance, social tolerance, and that there is this power relationship that exists between the subject and the object. So that means that tolerance does not imply that everything goes. There are obviously certain limits, and clearly in the UAE we see that social inequality still exists. So that means that just because there is the concept of tolerance as a top-down approach that the government is trying to push for, does not mean that all are equal in society, or that's the goal that the UAE is pursuing. It's mainly focused on religious ideas and coexistence is what I would want to point out to. Now, of course, there is a discrepancy between how the concept of tolerance is commonly discussed in academia and how it's being practiced on the ground. So what we're seeing here is a case study of a country trying to implement the notion of tolerance. It's not always successful, but it's at least an attempt to try to, put it into practice. Now, of course, if you look at the relationship or the correlation between tolerance and issues like education, perceptions of threat, personality, disposition, and so on and so forth, you see that there are certain variables that play into the practice of tolerance. So I won't get into that, but I just want to emphasize that tolerance obviously is commonly defined in a Western sense, but it can be applied in a non-Western sense as well. So when we talk about tolerance, we shouldn't always think of it in a kind of a Western way, but there are different variants as well. Now, again, the UAE looks at tolerance and bases its philosophy of tolerance on 7 key pillars. Islam, the UAE constitution, Sheikh Zayed, who was the founding father of the UAE when it was created in 1971, international conventions, archaeology and history, human nature and common values. I don't want to get into each and every one of them, but clearly one of the main reference points is the personality and charismatic figure of Sheikh Zayed, that's often referred to in many documents as the founding father, as someone who kind of treated people who worked and lived in the UAE with respect, with tolerance, and so on and so forth. So the UAE derives some of its justification of why it's employing the concept of tolerance from the founding father of the UAE. It also looks at the historical experience of the UAE, and it claims that this is part of the Emirati culture. Again, I talked about the significance of Sheikh Zayed, his actions, his human relations, his treatment of minorities. Of course, the UAE constitution also has, as of recent, undergone some changes, and we see that there are certain laws that have been put in place, particularly crimes against religious minorities or religious hostile, expressions. So there are these types of rules and regulations that are now in the constitution and in the legal code of the UAE that punish people or put them in jail or fine them or expel them from the country if this is somehow seen as problematic by the authorities. Of course, tolerance is also kind of a tool for socializing young Emiratis into taking on this behavioral trait of tolerance. We see it being exemplified in high schools, in textbooks, in educational curricula, and so on and so forth. So it's also a way of socializing young into adopting this type of approach. Talking about the notion of tolerance, we'd also have to look at the UN General Assembly pronouncement, because that's where the UAE also refers to as where it's in sync with kind of international organizations and how they define the concept of tolerance. So very often you hear people referring to UN charters and UN declarations in terms of how this concept is being defined. We see a whole slew of different initiatives that the UAE has implemented over the years, from the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Society in 2014 to the federal decree in 2015, the creation of the Ministry of Tolerance in 2016. The UAE would claim that it's the first country to have done so. The UAE cabinet has also issued the National Tolerance Program, has created the World Tolerance Summit and International Institute for Tolerance in 2018, and declared the year 2019 the Year of Tolerance, which coincided with the papal visit to the UAE. Last but not least, we have the document of Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together, as well as the building of the Abrahamic Family House in Abu Dhabi on Yas Island, that's seen as multi-religious complex. So again, you can see here from all of these different initiatives that the UAE is trying to somehow institutionalize the concept of tolerance in some form or shape. You also see that statements and speeches and various documents have mentioned this notion of tolerance, but not just at the higher level, but also administrative and foreign policy level. So if you look at Omar Gobash and Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who's the UAE ambassador to Washington, constant references to the idea of tolerance are found in many of his speeches and his declarations. So in essence, it's a top-down initiative trying to find some sort of grassroots support, and some would argue that it's been quite successful at doing so. Okay, so what is the function and purpose of the notion of tolerance? Well, at one level, you can say that it's a narrative, a discourse that is trying to frame or justify certain policies that the UAE is trying to implement regionally, globally. It's a signal that it is a liberal, progressive country to try to attract expats to come and work in the UAE, that it's a welcoming, diverse, open society, that it's respectful of difference, that people can practice their religions openly. So there is an economic angle to it. that it's a soft power tool to differentiate itself from other GCC countries. So the UAE, I mean, obviously some of you might know Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, they've always been competing for attention as small states, as middle states who are trying to kind of, shine in the international arena. So part of this is also to highlight the uniqueness, for it to be seen as a role model in the Arab world to compete with other GCC countries, and obviously to appeal to a Western audience, specifically the United States. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's trying to also strengthen and expand its foreign investments by presenting itself as a safe country, as a tourist destination. It's also kind of developed inclusive policies that are focused on the golden visa and citizenship rights. So not too long ago, the UAE has implemented a golden visa that allows people to reside in the UAE for 10 years without a work permit, whereas previously everything was tied to a work permit. And of course, there are certain opportunities to apply and to obtain a citizenship, although it's somewhat selective, obviously. Policies of tolerance are, again, also meant to kind of position itself in the fight against violent extremist Islamist movements, and in particular against the Muslim Brotherhood. And it does so by promoting the notion of moderate Islam. It's also created an Emirates Fatwa Council that is, in essence, state-sanctioned Islam, whereby certain committees appoint and select religious figures to certain mosques in the UAE, obviously, and they undergo certain training, and they're kind of responsible for, having the Friday sermons. So all of this is government controlled. So again, this is part of what you would argue is the notion of tolerance, why it's important and relevant. Just on a short note here in terms of terrorism and counterterrorism, obviously there are certain vulnerabilities if you look at the UAE as a whole. Its iconic buildings and mega malls would make for a very spectacular attack. It's investor-friendly and politically stable, so you would assume that Al-Qaeda or Islamic State would want to somehow land a blow so that this country would then maybe suffer from, people leaving the country, or the UAE suffering an economic blow. Again, the UAE has become more assertive in regional politics. We've seen this with its approach to Yemen, as well as with Daesh. And of course, you could argue that part of the reason why attacks have not happened is because of its functionality for certain actors that are using the UAE as a smuggling hub or as a banking, hub. And the fact that a lot of these groups cannot really stage a large scale attack as of recent. There aren't really any significant marginalized populations in the UAE. As I mentioned, 85% are expats that are doing fairly well economically, are not politically involved or politically motivated. And the Emiratis are predominantly Sunni, have a lot of benefits, and the Shia minorities that do exist are fairly well integrated. So you don't have these sectarian issues that you might have in other countries. Again, after the Arab Spring, you did have some concerns about returning jihadists and lone wolf attacks, but they haven't really materialized. I just want to briefly touch on three issues that the UAE sees as problematic, or has seen as problematic, with different foci. Iran obviously is still a concern based on the notion of the Shia threat, the nuclear developments in the three islands that is still in the background. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, although not as capable and not as instrumental as it was after the Arab Spring, is still in the background, because Al-Islah, that is kind of a local derivative of the Muslim Brotherhood was present in the UAE, but in very small numbers. It didn't really have lots of grassroots support and a lot of sympathizers, but there was a concern about the educational influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in institutions in the UAE. So that's why it kind of gained a lot of momentum. And of course, Daesh, because of its territorial gains, was seen as a threat in the early stages, now not as much anymore. Again, just briefly on the counterterrorism measures, again, tolerance is just one part of the puzzle. It's not the only approach, but you have a number of other approaches, be it obviously intelligence measures. There are very strong intelligence surveillance methods that are rampant in the UAE. You have the Hidayah Center for Excellence in Countering Violent Extremism, Sawab, a digital platform that's has been put in place with the help of the United States, as well as the public declaration of 83 terrorist groups in 2014, and not to mention a number of other terrorism laws that are in place. But again, I think, to end my presentation, I just want to quickly point out that these are all kind of the common harsh methods of dealing with terrorism, but there's also an element of trying to kind of implement the notion of tolerance in terms of forgiveness. So every National Day in the UAE, which is on the 3rd of December, you have various rulers forgiving people for their crimes, setting them free, allowing them to resume a normal life, obviously on certain preconditions. But of course, this doesn't apply to all crimes that have been committed, but there is a sense of trying to allow people to resume a normal life under the supervision of their family and obviously strict government monitoring. But it is, in a way, a kind of a method of trying to employ the concept of tolerance. And I'll end it at that. Thank you.
And last but not least, I would invite Professor Dr. Jeffrey Kaplan, who is, as you well know, a distinguished research fellow of the Danube Institute and organizer of this conference, to hold his speech on the details of the research around this conference.
Thank you. The panel's running a bit long, and I've gone through some of this in the introduction. So I will go through this quickly, first by getting this right and saving time that way, and second, trying to skip over some of the things we've already talked about. So to begin, attacks on Christians, their communities, and institutions has become endemic. It impacts perhaps 1 in 7 believers worldwide, which is an incredible number. And these maps are somewhat divergent, but they give you an idea of how widespread this violence really is. It's not one region, it's not one area, and it's not just between Muslims and Christians, Jews and Christians, etc. It involves a lot of actors. I mentioned before that attacks on Christians, anti-Christian violence, is perhaps the least studied area of religious violence. There are many reasons for this. One are political sensitivities. And it is something that in a lot of universities they simply don't want to talk about in the West because of a number of political sensitivities. There are also diplomatic sensitivities as well. We prefer not to delve into some of the embarrassing issues of our allies and to magnify those of our enemies. And this goes back and forth quite a lot. As we said before, the perception that Christians are by definition persecutors. So how could they possibly persecute? How could they be the persecuted? And that is incredibly widespread, not only in academia, but in the world generally. The issue is highly politicized on all sides. And I think researchers also have to take a good share of the responsibility for this. It is politicized not only in many cases by those who study it, as well as by those who deny it. So this is the idea of this project, to try to get past this politicization and simply follow the data wherever it leads. Anybody who has done field work in conflict areas will quickly learn one thing. Trust me on this. Trust nobody. Everybody has their own agenda, and it is very easy to be captured by those agendas. So there's a saying in computer studies, garbage in, garbage out. If you're getting false information, if you're publishing false information, your study is going to be false. There's just no way around it. It's very hard to get below that area because you can't just parachute into an area and think you understand it. You've got to have considerable local contacts, both before and during the research. And each one of those has their own agenda. Each one of those has their own perception of the world. And you have to be able to balance your sources so that you get, this is the idea that I went through in the introduction. You see the world through the eyes of the other. You're not trying to prove somebody right or wrong. You see all of the stories, and then you make your analysis after seeing every aspect that you can. Do not, as we say in ethnology, do not go native. It's a great mistake. The inaccessibility of some of these regions, and this is just obvious stuff. I'll go through some of the countries we're going to look at. One of them is Syria. I don't know if we can get into Syria right now or not in the areas where we want to study. It's in Arabic, inshallah, if God wills. But you have to realize some of the things you'd love to study. North Korea would be a fascinating area to study. I'm not going there anytime soon. China would be really remarkable. I worked in China some years before coming here and learned you don't make that kind of research there if you want to leave again. So some things are just inaccessible, and you just have to accept it as such. You can do your studies from outside sources. You can do your studies from refugees and from NGOs and from governments, but ultimately you're not going to get into the area to do the kind of interview-based research that we do. So you just have to accept the limitations of your studies. We've already talked about this, so I'm going to skip over this. These are the various forms of violence that we've been looking at. The study will include field work by a team of male and female researchers, and this is really important. You've got to have both genders to get the full story. In traditional societies, I can't walk into somebody's house and talk to the women. It is not done. And vice versa with female researchers. And so it's extremely important to have a balanced group who are able, with security, to be able to do this research together, each in their own sphere, each in their own area, to come back with a complete story. So we've started in the EU. Our very first study was in Poland, looking at internecine violence, and I'll look at that when we finish up here. We're also planning to go to France, which is a mess. In the Middle East, we're going to Egypt, Iraqi Kurdistan, Jordan, Palestine, and, as I say, inshallah, Syria, although that may not be possible at the time. We don't know. And in South Asia, Pakistan, where I worked for a year just immediately before coming here. And so we do have a lot of contacts there. Contacts are extremely important. You can't do this research without them. They will help to prepare your way, and they will help you when you are in the field. You simply cannot parachute in, I can't stress that enough, and think you're going to get anything. So having trusted local contacts, having people you know and can work well with are extremely valuable. Not only in introducing you there, but the way this research really happens in the field is you go into an area, you are introduced to a group of people that you are going to interview. They come to trust you, and they open doors in their belief system, in their religious system, etc. And pretty soon you find from going there with maybe 10 interviews set up, you're interviewing, as we found in Poland, all day and all night, because a lot of people are open to you because they trust what you're going to do. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a story, and they want to tell it. Sometimes they're afraid, sometimes they feel that you're not going to listen, or you're not going to treat it fairly. I'll give you a quick example that has nothing to do with this, but it's the same methodology. In the 90s, early 2000s, I was doing a lot of field work in the radical right. Neo-Nazi groups, National Socialists, Klan, you name it, skinheads. They were the strangest and most fun. And these right-wing violent groups, militia groups, and that kind of thing, they were resistant to being interviewed because they're afraid of it. And they looked at my name and said, "Kaplan, are you a Jew?" And I said, "Okay, come ahead." Once you start the interviews, once you start your publications, these publications are passed around. And it establishes your credentials. They say, "Okay, you're not on our side, obviously, but this is fair. And you're giving a valid analysis. We may agree with some of it, we may not, but at least you're being fair about it." And that opens yet more doors. So that's what's possible here, but it takes time and it takes effort. Other countries. In Africa, Nigeria, Sudan, and Uganda. Sudan is a place that I did a lot of my master's research in. I love that country. It is a challenging place, to put it mildly. But it's also a large place, and it's also very difficult to get around. Nigeria has its dangers, as Stephen would be able to testify to. And Uganda is an absolutely fascinating place. But again, it will take a lot of preparation to get there. It will take a lot of introductions, and you have to understand where you are. The research goes over a 2-year span, and it involves, as I say, considerable cooperation. Hungary Helps has been and will be extremely helpful in making this research possible. I included a Polish organization here. It's a think tank legal institute, Ordo Luris. And the reason I put them in there is because they were the first interview by chance that we did when we got to Poland. And they appreciated what we were doing. They understood that we were there fairly, that we wanted to talk to everybody, and there was a bond of trust established there. So all of a sudden, doors started to open in the Catholic Church, in the conservative groups, and eventually to some of the youth movements, the church defenders and the like. So suddenly doors opened because people opened them. And that's extremely important. Before undertaking this field work, researchers have to undergo serious training. They have to know what they're doing. First, the interview methodology, the interpretive approach, which honestly is my approach, so I use it. I rather like it. And understanding of history, politics, and social structures of the place where the field work is going to take place. We'll have guest lectures by academics and NGO specialists in the area. There has to be a lot of intensive training going into it. A thorough understanding of gender roles and the expectations in each country. A disciplined, teamwork-based approach to the research, which demands strict neutrality and an openness to all points of views, including those of local authorities, governments, and perpetrators alike. Everybody has a story, and they have a rage to tell it. The expectation that considerable work needs to be done after we return to Budapest with the raw data of the interviews and the experiences into academically sound books, articles, podcasts, and video presentations. The field work is what everybody gets excited about, but as my researchers will tell you, once you get back, the work really begins, and it's not as much fun. Finally, our first field work was in Warsaw and in Turin, Poland. We had begun the research into Poland actually almost 2 years ago, but it was at the height of the COVID pandemic. So there was a lockdown, and they were not allowing Americans to go over the border and on American passports because we would spread disease. And God knows they had enough of that disease as it was. So we did this largely by video conferencing, Zoom interviews. And those interviews at that time, the early ones, were with the feminist groups. This was at the point that the protests against the church were at their absolute height. And so you had large groups of women and some men who were supporting them in the streets, attacking churches, going in and disrupting services, and generally getting the world's media attention in a very big way. So we had the opportunity to interview people like Marta Lampert and some of the leaders of that movement who opened doors in that area. We also interviewed people from Ordo Laris who opened doors in that area. So we had a background of interviews and research studies before we actually got to Poland itself, before we actually arrived there. Once there, we did a number of interviews, and you can read how varied they really were. So church people, think tanks, conservative and left-wing. We talked to LGBT groups. We talked to the women's movement. We talked to right-wing groups. We talked to church defenders and young, let us say, very conservative right-wing guys with big muscles, those kind of guys. And we interviewed them all, and we got a very interesting, complete, kaleidoscopic picture of what was happening. And again, what made that possible were our colleagues from Poland, who were able to open doors, suggest interviews once we were there, and made this research possible. But again, that was only a beginning. We're working with that material now. Finally, as we said, it's the second in a series. The projected last conference in this series will be on Africa. And hopefully that will be the conclusion of the conference agenda, and it will also be during the time we'll be doing the fieldwork research. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And yes, as Professor Kaplan said, we are running a bit late, but I think one or two questions are still in order. So I'd like to open the stage for the audience, and please signal if you have any questions. Father, please.
Thank you very much for this session and for this conference, Jeffrey, and I appreciate all the effort that you did to welcome us in Budapest. Mr. Christian, can I ask you, please, a question about the Emirates, because I was following always the conferences of the Summit Meeting of Tolerance, the Pope Francis visit. There is a misunderstanding in the world, especially in our Arab countries, about building the three worship places, the Kenis, synagogue for Jewish, church for the Christians, and mosque for the Muslims in the same area. Some of the analysts say that it would be Abrahamic religion, and Pope Francis is creating with the Emirates a new religion. I think we have to clarify things. We don't want a religion to eat the other, but we want to create cooperation and understanding, mutual understanding between the religions. So I think we are asked, all of us are asked to clarify things It is not a new religion that is created in the Emirates, but it is collaboration between religions and mutual respect. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you. These are great presentations, and I've got questions for all of you, and I'm glad it's 2 days we're here so I can corral you later on. But I have a question specifically again for Dr. Alexander. Speaking of the word tolerance, what we're seeing in Iraq in these last 2 years amongst the hierarchy, especially the Christian hierarchy in the church, is a move to distance themselves from tolerance as an objective. And the reason for that is because there's a growing view of tolerance as something that is held exclusively by the dominating power as a discretionary tool that they can either apply or take away at their own decision against the minorities. And instead what they're saying is, don't speak to us of tolerance. What we want is equality under law. Obviously the situation, because they said tolerance, we don't care whether you tolerate us or not. We want a legal framework that says we are equal as citizens under law, because they've just lost faith in the unwritten bargain, if you will, of tolerance as just being a one-sided thing. Obviously, the situation on the ground in UAE and Iraq are remarkably different, but I'd be curious if you have a response to give back to the Christian minorities or the Yazidi minorities and some of the other Middle Eastern countries about this concept of tolerance. Is it something that can apply in these other countries, or is what you're doing in the UAE something that's unique?
Thank you for the question. It's hard to answer that question in a straightforward manner. I mean, obviously, the UAE is trying to kind of instrumentalize religion or the concept of tolerance to create the image of an all-inclusive, of an all-diverse, multicultural society that allows for the practice of religion, and again promoting the notion of moderate Islam, again responding to Western criticism of the UAE or the Gulf or the Middle East being kind of hostile to Christianity, but of course to other religions as well. Yes, there is this idea or understanding that it's mainly about the main denominations. I mean, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the way the UAE interprets Islam, obviously, or the way the UAE views Islam. So, again, to say that this is implementable in other political circumstances is hard to say. I don't think the UAE has reached a point where it could say that it's been extremely successful at doing so. I would say it's work in progress, and it's an attempt by a state to use the concept of tolerance with all of its contradictions and problems that are in place and that have to be acknowledged. But again, I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is a role model that other countries could latch onto and use in that same format as the way that the UAE is doing it.
I have a question relating to the UAE as well. It was not clear for me from the presentation if a Christian denomination, let's say an evangelical or Pentecostal, can they open a church in Abu Dhabi or in any other part of the United Arab Emirates, or it's for Christians is only valid for the so-called traditional denominations? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. No, and especially in Dubai, there are many, many Christian denominations. There's a Mormon church, believe it or not. So there are many Christian denominations. It's not just the Catholic Church or the mainstream Christian churches that you would assume, but a number of different Christian churches, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh temples that exist there. Now, of course, I would assume, or I'm pretty certain, you'd have to apply for a permit. You would have to be approved by the government. So as long as it's a church that's somehow internationally recognized, then I wouldn't see why the UAE wouldn't allow these churches to open a congregation or have meetings on Sundays and so on and so forth. So, no, it's not just meant for the mainstream conventual churches that you tend to assume, but it's open to many different sub-denominations as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, but we are gonna have a 15-minute break, and I encourage everyone who still like to talk to the panelists to find them during the break and ask your questions. So we're gonna start our third and last panel at 15:30. Thank you very much.